Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Devin Bendixson, a lead for our Knowledge and Learning Management team here at Schellman. Thank you for participating in today's webinar, Demystifying FedRAMP. With that, Mike, I'll hand it off to you to get us started.
Great. Thanks, Devin. Thanks for everyone for joining us today. It's great to see a lot of old friends and new folks that are joining us for this discussion. We've been geeking out about this for probably about the last 2 months as Nick, Kenny, Jason, and I came up with the idea to do a 3-part series around FedRAMP. So this is chapter 1 of 3. We'll have a couple more in the upcoming months, but quick introductions. I'm Mike Parisi. I'm the head of client acquisition here at Schellman. I'm joined by one of my colleagues and one of our federal practice leaders, Nick Rundong, who's a managing director here at Schellman. An old friend of mine, Mr. Kenny Scott, who's the founder and CEO of Paramify. Kenny and I go way back to our years at PwC together. And lastly, Jason Ford, who is the CEO and CISO of one of our strategic advisory partners, Patriot Partners. So thank you, gents, for joining me today. I know we're all looking forward to this discussion. We have a jam-packed agenda with a number of items that we think are relevant for today's discussion, and a lot more to come in our 3-part series. But, Nick, I want to start with you. Obviously, when we talk about FedRAMP, we hear a lot of confusion in the marketplace. I think we're seeing an uptick relative to adoption as it relates to FedRAMP. But there's so many moving parts, right? What is this thing that is FedRAMP? Why does it exist? Why is it so hard? Who are all the different people, right, that we need to work with in order to get there? Us being obviously the number 1 3PAO in the world and having done more of this than anyone else, I guess I'd like to start with you and tell us, why was FedRAMP created?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So really it's about protecting federal data and information. FedRAMP is Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program. So really in there, the management of authorizations. I like to think it's kind of broken down into 3 main reasons, and there's a lot of reasons FedRAMP was created, but protecting federal data in cloud environments. So as cloud adoption became more prevalent, they needed a way to apply security controls to cloud environments. So you always had to protect federal data. FISMA's been around for a while, but what they were finding is a lot of one-off reports when an agency wanted to use a cloud product. That's very inefficient. So FedRAMP came around and kind of centrally managed that. It meant instead of one-off reports, you could do one report and leverage that many times. So that centralization was a key component for why it was created. That led to cost savings, which is another big one. They have stats out on their website, and I think they quote numbers in the billions, I think, for it saving a lot of money, because it's very intense and costly to go and verify all these controls are in place. So centralization, cost, and then the other thing they really did was a lot of definitions. So they use controls, security controls in the NIST Special Pub 853. Those give a lot of leeway to organizations. It'll say things like, organizationally defined. FedRAMP defined those things. So what they did was they sort of solidified a lot of those base parameters, as well as injected, while they did that, a consistency through what we call con-mon activities. And I'll get to that as well a little bit later. But they put in a process to make it continuous on a yearly basis, monthly basis, even daily checks.
Awesome. Super helpful. Thanks for that baseline, Nick. So now that we understand why it was created, Jason, who's this relevant for? I mean, Nick was talking about cloud service providers, but who is it really relevant for? Because we all know in our collective roles, a lot of organizations are asked about FedRAMP, and sometimes it's something that they can't even get because it's not relevant for them. So talk to us a little more about who should really be paying attention to this and who's it relevant for.
Yeah, it's really anybody who is dealing with federal data and US federal data, and you're a cloud service provider. So if you have an application, whether you're doing that in an on-prem virtual way or you're doing it through a public cloud provider like AWS GovCloud or AWS East West or another public cloud, that basically defines the requirement. So if you're touching that agency data or you're a commercial entity servicing someone else who's touching agency data, that's whenever you'd have to go through this and then apply these controls to your system, your application, whether that's an infrastructure play, a platform play, or a software as a service play. Those are all really the requirements to go through that.
Got it. I want to stay on you for 1 minute, Jason, because you've now said this term in addition to Nick. So I just want to define it quickly. What's an agency? Can you give us an example of, for those that maybe aren't too familiar?
Yeah, an agency would be a civilian agency in the US government. So for instance, Department of Treasury, Department of Energy, anything Department of Education. Could also be subdivisions inside of that. So for instance, in energy, it could be a national laboratory. It could be something that's smaller to that. Most of the time, those internal entities of those agencies report up into a global security office that will be controlling most of that. But in some cases, there's one-offs inside the government space. But that's one word to say agency. That's what we refer to.
Awesome. Thank you. Kenny, next one's for you. So we understand why this was created, who it's relevant for. What's it based on? You know, Nick was dropping some term out there, NIST 853. Like, what is all this stuff? What is it based on, that set of controls and requirements?
Sure. So early 2000s, despite .com bust, U.S. government decides, you know what, this internet thing, there's something here, right? So NIST gathers a bunch of experts, wise sages of tech, and they developed kind of a comprehensive framework to manage and secure information systems. So they didn't just make things up on the fly. They combined best practices from different security models, government policies, and like real world incidents. So the result was NIST 800-53, and that's a massive catalog of security controls with parameters in there that can be, modified depending on the organization or, in FedRAMP's case. But it covers everything from the basics of access control to even like nitty-gritty of encryption. So FedRAMP, depending on the security objectives of the system, will implement a subset of those NIST 800-53 controls. So we refer to those as profiles within that.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Nick, let's go back to you. So not all FedRAMP assessments, if you will, are created equal, right? There's this concept of varying levels, or what we refer to baselines. Can you elaborate on those for us? What are these different baselines? Some of them seem pretty straightforward, low, moderate, high. But those can mean very different things. And how do you know what you're required to do from a baseline perspective? So elaborate on that for us.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the system security plan a little bit more in detail later. But know it's a document that describes every system. So when we're talking about these systems that are cloud products, they have this document that describes them in full, and all those security controls that Kenny was talking to that apply to that system. As part of that, really before you get to know which controls apply to you, you have to go through an exercise where you use another one of these NIST special pubs. This one's 800-60. And you go through and you look at the type of data, you categorize your data that you're going to process, transmit, and store. And you have to do an impact rating of that data. Now that's an elaborate exercise. Probably could do a whole webinar on that. But know that you analyze it against CIA, the concept of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And each one of those you classify at low, moderate, or high impact. So CIA, and you'll get LLL or MLM, low based off of CIA. High watermark, you'll hear that term. The highest that any of those are is what your system is categorized at. So you go through that exercise, and it's an elaborate exercise, but then you come up with this rating, and it's low, moderate, or high. FedRAMP has designated, based off that catalog that Kenny was just describing that I mentioned earlier, 800-53, they're currently on Rev 5. It's got like thousands of controls. They have baselines that'll say these certain controls map to low, moderate, or high, wherever you ended up. You must apply all of those to your system. You described them in that SSP that I talked about. But those are the baselines. So really there's three: low, moderate, high. If you're a SaaS product, you can actually get what they call a tailored one, and they call it LI SaaS, low impact SaaS. What it does, it's still the same number of controls as low, but there's a bunch of them that the cloud service provider themselves gets to attest to. So it makes it a little easier. FedRAMP recognized that there's going to be so many of these SaaS products at low, they need to make it a little bit easier. Rough control counts on those, you're looking at 125 at low, 323 at moderate, and 421 high. So you see it escalates as you go. Plus, even if some of those controls are the same across all those, they get more difficult the higher you go.
That sounded like some pretty exact numbers. I don't know if I'd call that rough numbers, but thanks for that explanation. I guess just staying on you really quick, is there an instance where the agency will dictate or tell you where you need to be?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can look at the products out there in the marketplace, and there's not always a rhyme or reason. Sometimes an agency just says, no, we are going to put in high impact data in here. We want your system up to those protection levels. So when I said it was elaborate, it's because a lot of times you're going to work with that first agency, or you have a target in mind because, you know, different federal agencies or other tenants are going to use your product differently than maybe even you anticipated. So it can only be up to the level that you're authorized, though, that the impact of the data they put in there. So it's a little bit of a process to figure out where you need to be, and some of it is even marketability.
Kenny, let's close this out with you. You know, we hear a lot about, in the FedRAMP space, ATOs, authorizations. Sometimes we hear certification. We'll handle that one a little bit later. But what is an authorization? What does that mean to an organization that becomes quote unquote authorized?
Yeah, it's a good question, because a lot of people do say, like, hey, are you FedRAMP certified? We get that question a lot, and it's okay. They can say that, right? But what really is government networks are set up differently than the public internet. So some people may have heard of a network called NIPRNet, so DoD's network. So every system that connects on that network has to have an ATO, or an authority to operate. So it's an official authorization granted by a senior government official, and they're allowing an information system or a cloud service to process, store, or transmit that data that has gone through that 800-60 evaluation that Nick was just talking about. And so it signifies that a system has met all of the required security controls and continues to meet those security controls, and it's deemed secure enough to operate within a government environment. And so just go back a couple decades, there's people within, Pentagon or within agencies that are like, hey, this whole EC2 thing that Amazon has, this is pretty awesome, and we want to do that. But then you have they don't have an authority to operate yet. So hence we have, Amazon pursuing FedRAMP, they have GovCloud, and even their East-West service is also authorized at the moderate level.
Do I need multiple? Like, what happens if I get one? Does that mean I can use it with other agencies, or do I have to get one for every agency that I work with?
That's a good question. So every agency is going to have to authorize you on to access their environment. Right.
All right. So moving on. Since we covered this concept of authorization, Nick, let's start with you. There's different avenues and ways, right, that you can obtain an authorization. Put the whole assessment piece aside for a second. But, if I'm an organization and I'm looking at my options, what options are available to me in order to obtain an authorization, recognizing that some of those options might actually be winding down and going away. So we threw a couple out here that we think are most common that a lot of clients speak about, but maybe you can elaborate on what are the different paths that organizations can take today and what's that going to look like in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. Really, and it's probably one of the biggest downfalls of FedRAMP is you need an agency. You need a sponsor in order for PMO to review that package and then to get listing on the FedRAMP marketplace. There were two. One is JAB, Joint Authorization Board, which doesn't require an agency, but as of right now, it is in transition. So it was a way that if you showed enough demand, you could apply to a Joint Authorization Board. And even if you don't already have an authorization, you could go that route and not have to bring a sponsor with you. It was a selection process, all that. Any that are currently selected, they put out a blog on the 12th, so just like a week and a half ago, talking about their transition. They're going to currently let those ones keep going through, and if you currently have a JAB, you can continue doing it. For everyone else, they're not accepting anything to JAB right now. So I wanted to mention that, but know that it's in transition and something that will come about. Agency. Basically, you find someone that wants to use your product, that's willing to take on the roles and responsibilities of a sponsor. Now, that's on the FedRAMP website. If you go to the resources tab, you can see they have a playbook for both CSPs and agencies. So smart to get familiar with that, even if you're a cloud service provider, so you know what an agency needs to do and you can help them through that. Basically, they are with you through the whole process, the whole authorization process. They're going to look at the package that a 3PAO creates after your system's ready to go, all that, it gets assessed. That package, the result of that, will go to that agency first. What Kenny was talking about, an ATO, those are individually by an agency. You only need one to get you going, right? So they sign that, accept that risk. That lets FedRAMP PMO then review your package. They won't review it unless you have one of those. So it's important to have a lot of good communication with an agency that's willing to be a sponsor in order to get to that point. That can be one of the hardest things to do in the path to becoming FedRAMP authorized. So currently, it's FedRAMP agency or nothing. Read that blog. They're going to come out with more. They're moving towards this one FedRAMP authorization, some multi-agency support, some programmatic authorizations. More to follow on that. Just know that JAB is not really there for anyone right now to net new get into that program. But that's pretty much the path right now, agency.
Thanks, Nick. I'm not going to ask you for tips to get ready for the fashion show or how to figure out the dating scene when it comes to agencies. Maybe we'll keep that for a follow-up webinar. But as you mentioned, it's obviously one of the most difficult things for organizations to obtain, regardless as to how mature their security program may be. I mean, they may meet all the requirements and be ready to go, but absent having that agency, they can't get authorized. And a little bit later on, we're going to talk about, so what are some other options, right? Maybe if you're not authorized, but just to foot stomp that, I think a lot of organizations, especially that we talk to, and I think we talk to collectively, but especially us being 3PAO, they're not ready for us when we have the initial conversation because there's a lot of things that haven't been done up front, inclusive of getting an agency sponsor. So, Nick, you mentioned some of the documentation and the deliverables, and there's all these different terms that are out there. I remember when I first started learning about this, like, what's the difference between all these things? Kenny, how about we go to you, since Paramify is in this business of helping organizations not only identify what they need to do, but do it in an automated fashion, quicker, better, more efficient than I think anyone has really seen in the marketplace. So can you walk us through, I know we didn't put everything on here, but walk us through some of these key components and pieces around deliverables associated with this process.
I would just start with the SSP. This is the system security plan. It's a detailed document, outlines system architecture, security controls, procedures. It's the blueprint of your cloud system security. So I think that often it's a missed opportunity. We need to use the SSP to design our ideal security architecture, not just document what we have and just scramble to fill in the boxes for AC1 Part A, AC1 Part B, Part C, all of that. I think that's not the way to do it. We want to start with our people, places, and things. We do a list of roles in the personnel that are going to be managing the system security. Where are you deployed? Are you deployed in a garage or are you deployed in GovCloud? That changes your risk profile. And then what are the tools that you're using? Here we are in 2024, and there are a ton of awesome security tools that help you actually implement these NIST controls in FIPS mode. And we're going to talk about that more later. But you want to know the data flow between those components at the outset. And we actually used Paramify to do this, and we started with building out our boundary diagram. And then once we did that, we put a lot of thought into that. Where are we having things encrypted? Who's doing what? How are we authenticating to our FedRAMP High environment? And then we got a second pair of eyes. They're here right on this call, and it's really cool to identify those gaps quick right off the bat. So I think the SSP is a great thing, and once you have your design, you just iterate and improve. It's a living, breathing document. Some people start with policies and procedures. I like the SSP. That's just how I do it. Then you got to implement the SSP. And then that's when, again, I think, Nick, we were talking about this earlier. This is where, you're going to have your auditor put together their SAP, the System Security Assessment Plan. And then there's the pen testing, right, which you have a lot of experience with.
And Kenny will talk about the SAR package, but we thought this was important enough to talk about. The SAR package contains a number of deliverables with it. But one key one is a penetration test. So a penetration test, once again, could be a whole webinar, but there's 6 prescribed vectors. So FedRAMP came out and said you must test every one of these cloud service offerings, the actual product, with these 6 vectors. Those include a phishing campaign, right? So against all of the cloud service providers, personnel that have production access. So there's an actual phishing campaign that goes out, and you get great results from it. There is tenant to tenant testing. So Department of X and Department of Y, so to speak, but you give that to the 3PAO pen test team. They see what they can glean, because even federal to federal shouldn't be able to glean information. They're also going to do a certain number of external attacks, internal, both untrusted and trusted, as well as trying to break out of the stack and do a few other things. There's also client-side testing and mobile app testing if those are in scope for your product. A lot of the effort is on web application. All that to say you get a big report that lists all of that and any findings in there. Any cross-site scriptings, any request forgeries, or if they stole a token via a phishing campaign. That's all in there. Whereas the testing that is on those controls we talked about, so for a moderate, the 323 controls, a lot of that is on the design, right? The effectiveness of that you do look at, but this is really on, okay, it says by design it should be working. Is it really? And you get trained folks coming in doing OWASP top 10 and other attack scenarios and on those vectors to see if the architecture is actually holding up. So the pen test is a subset of that SAR. That's what it entails. There's a lot to it, but that's kind of the highlights.
Right. You can't just put your right hand over your heart and say like, hey, this is my SSP and I did it and it's really good. It's actually going to get thoroughly assessed. But that's good. This is all part of the process of really managing risk. And so I think I used to, honestly, I'm embarrassed to say this, but I actually kind of hated FedRAMP quite a bit for a long time. But now understanding it, it really is a superior way to manage security risk. And so it's because of the thoroughness, right? For every single control, top down, the way you described that. So you're going to submit not only your SSP, but you're going to have the assessment results, which are going to be given by an auditor like Schellman, right? Those are going to be put together. You're going to have appendices A through R, maybe additional appendices. We add Appendix S, for the roles and the users, and there's all sorts of things that are going to come out, right? But finally, you have your POAMs, once you get authorized, right? Once you have your ATO. And so I think this is really the frequency that you need to think of. Every year, you're going to have an annual audit. You're going to have to test at least each control. When you say control, like, so in a FedRAMP High environment, there's 410 controls. There's actually sub requirements underneath those controls. So each of those controls needs to be assessed at least once every 3 years, right? So you kind of spread it out, and you can work with your auditor on the timing of that. I've seen continuous auditing throughout the year to kind of break it up, and then I've seen the intense do it at the end of the year. In particular, I'm a big fan of the, hey, let's do this throughout the year. So it gives you time to stay on top of things, right? So there's the annual audit, but then there's the monthly requirements for continuous monitoring, where you're going to do POAMs. We'll talk in more detail about those, but that is going to be running your scans against your environment, infrastructure, containers, your web app, more than that, right? And then also controls that break along the way. You need to continually assess those and make sure that they're operating. So annual audit, continuous monitoring. I don't know. There was something yeah. What was it? Oh yeah.
Sounds like a lot of stuff.
Yeah. I got this quote. You got to just listen to it. This is what it is, right?
Welcome to the hotel hell. Check-in time is now. Check-out time is never.
That's the quote.
Nice. I love it. So, obviously a lot of deliverable things to think about. I think the wave tops, Kenny, thanks for taking us through that. SSP, right? Start there. That shouldn't be a check the box exercise. Like, you should use that as an avenue to actually drive the definition of your security program. Pen test, Nick, just to confirm, required, right? Stop that. Like, there's no way of getting out of that. Like, that is something that you have to do. And Kenny, this isn't a one and you're done, right? We're going to talk about all the different types of things that you need to do as you nurture this program throughout the year. So with that, Jason, let's go to you. This is something that you and I have spent a lot of time talking about together and trying to educate the marketplace to make sure that organizations understand, like, there's a lot of different players in this equation, right? It's not just an auditor and an organization going through the audit. We've already listed out so many different stakeholders. So I want to put some better definitions to this, and you, being somebody that has been an auditor, an advisory readiness partner, an assessed entity yourself, and worked for the federal government, I think you understand all these roles and you played them at some point throughout your career. So talk to us a little bit about who are all the parties that are involved, starting with what we refer to as the assessed entity.
Yeah, so if you're listening to all this and you're part of this webinar, there's a lot of acronyms, right? So a lot of 3-letter acronyms. So you're going to be Googling a lot. Ask questions in the chat. If you don't know what something is, we can clarify. That's probably the easiest way to do it. And as we're talking about things, FedRAMP's full of 3-letter acronyms, and just like every other government thing that we deal with. So some of the things that, these parties that are involved here, we listed, really the 5 that we see the most. So the assessed entity is really the cloud service provider. That's the person who has the application that is being required to go through the FedRAMP process. So you have either an infrastructure as a service or a platform as a service or a software as a service play that you want to offer to a federal agency or someone who is interacting with the federal agency. That's you, right? That's the person that at the end of the day is going to submit the SSP, the system security plan. It's going to interact with the 3PAO and kind of go through that process. The relying party is the next one. So that's your sponsor. Much of what Nick said, agency is the only path right now to get authorized. There's other things you can do. We'll get to that a little bit later. But to get authorized, agency is your only path right now. So that is your sponsor. And that sponsor is that agency that we kind of talked about, department of whatever. Fill it in, whoever that is, right? So the other part of the relying party that we talk about a lot is the actual PMO itself, the project management office or program management office for FedRAMP. They're going to be integral to all of this. They control the marketplace, they control the final review. Doesn't matter whether you're going for authorized in process or if you're in another state. That's kind of one of the most important ones here, and to Nick's point, it is one of the harder ones to get. The next one is the enablement solution providers. So those are going to be things like, who's helping you with GRC, who's helping with compliance automation, who's helping you with threat detection, who's going through basically providing some of the things that are required by the controls inside of this whole thing that is FedRAMP to kind of get you through answering something for just like incident response as an example, or penetration testing or how do you do that, right? Those providers provide those ancillary services for you. The next one is consulting or advisory partners. We list these because a lot of agencies or a lot of CSPs don't have internal resources that understand FedRAMP or haven't gone through the process. So those are advisory partners come in and basically provide you with high level direction. There's kind of a couple different layers here we see. Typically, there's people who just advise and they'll just say, this is the direction you need to go, more high level strategic focused. There's people that will provide actual remediation services or do an assessment for you and then provide you a gap analysis of kind of what you need to go fix. And then there's people that also do remediation services that will go fix those gaps for you or help you fix those gaps. And then there's entities that do all three, right? So, and that's one of the things we kind of focus on is all three of those. Implementation is probably the hardest piece of this, along with just knowing the path. Obviously, knowing the path is documented, it's out there, but having those pieces kind of outlined and how to step through them is only a very small piece of this. Doing the implementation and remediation of the gaps is the hard part. Then the last piece is the 3PAO. There's some out there, but obviously Schellman is here today doing this webinar. Being a third-party assessment organization, you have to get accredited. There's a whole process to go through it. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, what that means. But they are integral to every part of this. While the CSP will write the system security plan, it's the 3PAO that's interacting with the FedRAMP PMO and writing the system assessment report and the system assessment plan to get it through the whole process. And that whole thing becomes your package to submit. So without them, none of this goes anywhere. And you having a very good relationship with your 3PAO and having an early relationship with them is key because they're going to be able to guide you a little bit on what's going to be some requirements and kind of talk to you at high level to go through that.
Thanks, Jason. I think that's a great overview, and I know we're going to dive into some of those in a little more detail here in a minute. For those that have missed the codes popping up on the screen, here's your next one, 417. I think we're going to drop that in the chat as well as we continue to move on in the discussion. Diving deeper into, Jason, what you covered, and this is something that I'm really passionate about, that I talk about with all of our prospects and clients, and I think that all four of us talk about together, right, is don't go this alone. If you think that you can really go down this path by yourself, I mean, we could tell you, we've seen some of the largest organizations in the world fail, right? Ask for help, and you need to make sure you're asking for help in all the appropriate areas. So we're going to talk about that. And I know there's a lot of confusion in a lot of organizations that we talk to. Nick and I ran into this earlier this week. We're the 3PAO, and we're getting the question of, so wait a minute, what do you guys do again? Do you guys write that SSP thing? And do you fix the issues that you find when you audit us? No, we don't do that. Well, who does that? Well, how do I connect with somebody in that vein? Oh, and by the way, I've been writing this SSP in a Word document for the last 4 months. Jason was talking about a number of 3-letter acronyms. Then they start using 4-letter words associated with trying to build this thing manually. Is there any solutions out there from an automation perspective? Oh, Schellman, do you do that? No, we don't do that either. But we know somebody that does. So, I think it's really important for those joining us to understand that there are multiple parties, and you really need to consider leveraging all of those parties at the appropriate time. We're at the end of the run, right, from a 3PAO perspective. But Kenny, let's start with enablement and solution providers, since that's where you guys, squarely fall within the marketplace. And I know you've helped a number of our clients and continue to support them. And I think when you and I talk, we view this as almost the first step, right? To understand what you have, what you don't have, what you're going to need. Because everything that an enablement and a solution provider does up front makes the job of the advisor or consulting partner easier, and certainly makes the job of the 3PAO easier. So talk to us a little bit more about what's your role in an organization that's in that space, in that category. Talk to us more about that.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I will just say, like right off the bat, there is no substitute for experience. Any advice you take from any individuals needs to be with someone who's gone through it multiple times. That's why when our clients work with Jason, right, and Nick, right, on the 3PAO side, they can't stop talking about how helpful these professionals have been, right? So actually implementing the security is the hardest thing, to Jason's point, but it's great to know where to start. We have so many clients that come to us that have, started the process on their own, and they have paid for a template and that they try to wade through on their own. And we hear, or we hear like, oh, we have a SOC 2. How close are we to FedRAMP? LOL, right? Without a good planning process to start, and without good tech to guide you through the process, you're going to end up losing a lot of time, and you're going to cause yourself a lot of headache. And since company leadership doesn't really understand, all these 4-letter acronyms that we're using and 4-letter words that they will be using inevitably, as they're going through this headache, they sometimes get blamed. Like, the person responsible for implementing FedRAMP, they're going to get blamed for it taking longer than expected. So starting with the right tech and the right partners is really crucial. What we do is we try to identify, how do we transfer risk to third-party providers, right? So if you're operating your own co-location, we have clients where we say, hey, where are you deployed? And they'll say, yes, we're deployed everywhere. We're like, oh man, that's going to be a lot harder, versus someone saying, hey, we're deployed in GovCloud, or we're deployed in Azure Gov, or we're deployed in GCP. There's a lot of controls that are actually transferred to those cloud service providers that are FedRAMP authorized. Absolutely, they need to be. But then there's other tools, right, like Okta, and that help you, manage authentication. And it's good to know someone that understands what a security plan should look like, and it just sets you off on the right path right away. So there's a lot of tools. I'm glad to be we just started our FedRAMP journey like last month, and I'm glad we are where we are, because it's just a lot easier now with all the tools that are available to us. And of course, great partners, right? Wouldn't be anywhere without them.
That's great. Thanks, Kenny. And, what I would add onto that, good friend of mine, we talk about the fog of more a lot, which is there's so many tools and solutions out there, right? How do you wade through them and determine what to use in order to help you with this initiative? So I think it's great advice. I'd also add, if you're evaluating certain tools, and this is probably a good segue, Jason, to you, run that by your consulting and advisory partner. They know what's out there. They know what makes a good stack, right, to help you from a FedRAMP perspective. Run that by them, and they'll be able to give you some insight and experience in terms of what's out there, what's vaporware, and what's actually good. So, Jason, I just mentioned one thing that a consulting and advisory partner can do, but there's obviously a lot under that. You alluded to some of those before as well when you talked about remediation support, et cetera. I mean, I would say, and you know, we'll get Nick's thoughts on this as we wrap this up before I give it to you. I mean, those organizations that we take through the process, for which there's a lot, those that are most successful and go quicker are those that have a real strong consulting and advisory partner up front. So talk to us a little more about what does this stakeholder do, somebody that's in this role, recognizing that they're not all created equal either. So be careful when you have some that say they can do everything under the sun, because they cannot. So do your diligence, but talk to us a little more about this role and how it fits into the equation.
Yeah, and I think Kenny summed it up best. Experience does matter here. And, you know, this has been around for 10 plus years at this point. You know, it has changed quite considerably from Rev 3 to Rev 5 now. And over time, it's gotten more mature, and there's a lot of things that you can trip over and literally fail for, right? And those failures have costs associated with them, both time and money, and your ability to then find clients to, you know, leverage your system that you're putting it through. It's not for the faint of heart, right? So that consulting advisory partner is someone who provides that expertise so you don't trip and fall, right? And whether that person is internal to you or whether that's an external entity, most of the time that's an external entity, because there's you know, a handful of people that have been operators in this space that know it and have been through it. And much to your point, you know, there's a lot of people who say that they've done it before and they haven't. And then once you get to the 3PAO position and you're ready to start going through an assessment, an audit, that's whenever the rubber hits the road, right? And if you don't know what you're doing, then your SSP is going to be garbage, your authentication boundary or your authorization boundary is going to be garbage, and then the whole thing's going to come out and it's just going to cost you a lot of money, right? And it's just a false start, and false starts in FedRAMP are 12 months. Typically, you know, that's what you're losing is 12 months. So that advisory partner, consulting partner is the one, and there are different levels of those, like I talked about, whether that's just high-level advisory, whether that's someone doing assessment for you, an internal assessment, and finding out where gaps are to you, or providing some ancillary services like writing policy and procedure, or using a platform like Paramify to do that for you, and then modifying those to your specific use case, or whatever that needs to be done from a gap perspective that you're not getting today, or it's remediation, right? So getting someone in that position, whether that's internal or whether that's external, is key and vital, that understand what they're doing and make sure you vet them. Because if you don't, and they don't have the pedigree, you're just risking time and money at that point.
I would add on to that, Nick, before we bring it home with you here, the relationship between your 3PAO and that consulting and advisory partner is absolutely critical. Right? You want to understand, how do they work together? Have they worked together in the past? How many times? What differing levels of assessments, et cetera, have they done together? Right? I mean, there's some consulting advisory partners that can't even spell high when it comes to FedRAMP, right? Maybe they can help you with low all day long. So you really want to understand what the experience of that partner is. And I can't stress enough how important it is from a 3PAO standpoint to ask the question, are they partners? Do they have a relationship? Have they worked together in the past? The familiarity that we have, for example, with Jason's documentation and the way that he approaches building a program, That's tremendous for us from a partnership standpoint, because we know if he is working with somebody, we know exactly what to expect, right? And it also helps from a level of effort perspective as well. When you think about pricing and level of effort, if Nick and I know that something is going to be in really good shape and it's going to be buttoned up by the time we get it, well, that's obviously going to impact the level of effort that we may need to spend on that. So with that, Nick, let's bring it home from a 3PAO perspective and talk about what the role of that organization is, and what it's not, and I think more importantly, what it cannot be, considering what some of the regulations and standards say.
Yeah, so 3PAO, third-party assessment organization, third party, so that implies independence. There are strict rules in place that essentially say a 3PAO, who's the one that comes and assesses you for those controls that we talked about at whatever baseline you're at, as well as performs that pen test, puts together that SAR package that actually has to go to your agency and the PMO for eventual ATO and authorization. They have to be independent from the work that was done to create the system. So if you consult, advise, configure a system, you can't assess your own work. Because you might have a good idea that a solution meets a control, but a third party, independent party needs to come in and see if that's the case. You'd be biased if you're checking your own work. So that's one of the reasons they created this whole program and whole process. 3PAOs for FedRAMP are accredited by A2LA. There's a short list of those. They're all in the FedRAMP marketplace. But you use one of those in order to do that. So what can they do? They can tell you how they're going to test and what a requirement is. They can tell you that you can scan your microservice containers in production or scan them before they go in the registry. They can't say you're going to use Qualys, set it up, use these Docker containers on this version, put them into ECR, right? Because you're talking about specific mechanisms and services that they'd be telling you help meet this requirement. Instead, they tell you what you're going to do. As far as that relationship you were talking about, y'all hit on it, experience, right? A lot of it has to do with seeing a lot of mechanisms and design types enough to understand what the questions will be and anticipate those coming from FedRAMP, from an agency. Very technical type questions. So you want someone that's experienced, has done this a lot, has been through those fights sometimes, has gleaned enough experience to be able to say how yours is meeting those controls according to their professional opinion. On this, good example being the blow up of AI recently and a lot of AI services and uses various different LLMs and vector databases. You want someone that has a lot of experience doing that, because the first time you see it, it's the first time you've seen that. What's the difference between that and a relational database, and what are the things that PMO may ask about? So experience means a lot. You heard all these three other folks say that. So yeah, that's the role of them, and that's the importance of the independence and experience.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, just to reemphasize a few things that we all talked about. Experience first and foremost. I like to say buyer beware. There are organizations out there that are 3PAOs, but also do consulting and advisory services. So be careful, right? You're not being sold on doing both at the same time, which could be a big violation. And God forbid you get all the way to the end just to find out that that's an issue. That's one of the reasons why, like at Schellman, we don't do any consulting and advisory. We only do the assessment by design. And then also, I think to Nick's point around experience, understanding what are all the different things that they've seen in the field. When we talk to our clients, and we are very definitive about whether something is a go or a no-go, it's because we've been in the trenches and through the significant emotional events of answering the questions, right, that may come up. So having those battle scars, I think, is really important from an experience perspective. Okay, in the last 10 minutes here, really quick, let's talk about what some of the common pitfalls and pain points are, and we'll do a little rapid fire here. Jason, let's go to you first around executive ownership, sponsorship. You've been in that seat multiple times, and you've had to make sure that you've had that. Why is that so important, and why can that create a pain point?
Yeah, it's one of the biggest showstoppers, I think, from a people perspective. And when we're talking about sponsor here, we're not talking about external, we're talking about internal to your CSP. So it really is someone who is going to have the ability to work across department. So you're going to be dealing with HR, you're going to be dealing with finance, you're going to be dealing with contracts, you're going to be dealing with technical controls, you're going to be dealing with everything, right? Policy and procedure doesn't just cover IT, right? It covers a lot of other stuff. You're going to be talking about cybersecurity awareness training. We already talked about what's part of a pen test. There's going to be phishing campaigns that are going to be running. You're going to want to do a pregame on a lot of that stuff, right? And one person doesn't just control that typically in a large organization or even in a smaller organization. So getting someone who has the ability to move east-west across the org chart is key. Don't have it be a director if you're a large organization. It has to be someone higher. Highest you can go, the better. Someone who can dictate, mandate, because all it does is it just causes time again to slip away. Because you're fighting a political battle to get someone to help you do something that may only take 10 minutes, but they keep saying no because they just don't want to do it.
Great advice. And I'd add on to that, the ownership and the sponsor cannot be just sales. Right? And saying, well, in order to close this deal, I need to get this done. And it shouldn't be. That's right. Yeah. Exactly. Even though they're the ones that may be screaming, but you got to get others in the boat with you. Kenny, we alluded to this already, but I think another huge pain point that organizations go through is around the documentation and the manual build. Anything to add there? I know that's a huge one that you guys see day in, day out.
Sure. Yeah. Managing thousands of pages of documents is a dark place, right? When you change out a component in your boundary, for example, like that's why we talked about it in the beginning. It's really important to architect your system security plan at the very outset and say like, hey, we're going to use this component because it's authorized at FedRAMP High. We can't use this one because we're a FedRAMP High system. We can't use this one now. So like, great. We documented this in 59 places and now we got to swap that out. And also we got to go to our procedures. And so doing a manual approach, it's going to be really hard, really fast if you're starting with page 1, step 1. What you want to do, you're not doing 827 different things. It's usually components that implement the different requirements. And so having a digital approach to it is great. And I'll just say swapping over to it is easier than ever now with tools like the one we have. There's other people that are trying to solve this, and I applaud that effort. People have this. We have some clients that say like, I have no attachment to my manually maintained SSPs. I'm ready to kind of move on. Then we have others that are like, really that thing has already been authorized, so we don't want to lose any of that information. So fortunately today, swapping to digital is absolutely a possibility. And it's faster than you think would be possible with the advent of AI and things like that. So yeah, don't do it manually.
Right. That's what we've seen as well. So staying on that theme of pitfalls, Jason, maybe a few comments around boundary and environment. I know we're going to do a deep dive on that in another webinar, but anything you want to highlight there?
Yeah, and we've talked about it. Kenny's talked about it in the SSP, right? So one of the things is data flow diagrams and authorization boundary diagrams, and where does the data sit, and how's it encrypted, and where does it flow to, and where does it go from across the boundary? That is the place that we start at first. Is if we can't draw a picture of it, it doesn't exist, right? So if you can't go into Lucidchart or use Visio in the old days or whatever you use for creating your network diagram, whatever that is, if you can't draw it, then it's going to be near impossible to make sure that you have everything covered in all your control answers, all your inheritance, all the stuff that you're going to try to push through. FIPS 140 is going to bite you. There's all kinds of vulnerability scanning is going to bite you. Penetration testing is going to bite you. It's all kinds of things that are going to just lead to, again, losing time. And then whenever you hit the 3PAO part of this, first question is going to be asked is show me a system diagram, right? They're going to start talking about it. They're going to start asking questions of, well, what's there? How's that? Where are you virtualizing at? Are you using containers? Are you using virtual machines in public cloud? Are you doing it on-prem? Whatever that is, if you can't draw that, then you're starting at a disadvantage already out of the gate.
Great. Awesome. So we are going to dive into some more of these, on some upcoming webinars, but just being conscious of time, why don't we wrap it up with, Jason, we'll stay on you, this concept of marketplace designations. So we talked about authorized before, but if people go to the site, they're going to see what's this ready, what's this in process. You want to maybe touch on that for a minute?
Yeah, sure. So if you go to the FedRAMP marketplace, you can type it in Google, it'll come up. There's 492 systems today in the marketplace, with 26 of those being the ready status. So there is only 3 status that you can have here in the marketplace. It's ready, in process, or authorized. There is nothing else. Those are the only 3. So no matter if you hear that from a salesperson, you hear it from someone else, it doesn't exist, right? So if it's in the marketplace, it only has three status. Ready is basically a step for you to take your system through. It's less rigorous than authorized. It doesn't require you to have your SSP fully defined. You have to do penetration testing. There's a few other things that like policy and procedure can be loosely defined. But you want to have it as defined as you can to get through the process. But what it basically puts your system into is a state that you're looking for an agency to sponsor you. So the agency has less risk. The PMO is still involved. The 3PAO is still involved, has to be involved, to get you to a place where your system is ready to have an agency assume less risk and then just check the boxes saying, yes, you have all the compliance things done from your documentation perspective. But the readiness does technical controls. Again, less demanding, tech focused. It's less risk to the sponsor. The other 2 pieces is in process and authorized. So we kind of already talked about authorized a good bit. But in process means that the system has an agency that has signed a letter of intent to sponsor to the FedRAMP PMO. That letter of intent basically says, hey, we're willing to take the system through and then review the package so they become your sponsor. That in process piece takes time to go through because they're obviously working with the agency. But that's why you'll see that in there as those systems are transitioning with the agency through the process in the PMO. Then authorized is the PMO has reviewed it, the agency has reviewed it, and in latter cases, the JAB has approved it, and you're now an authorized system with an authority to operate.
Awesome. And Nick, what's this, for the last topic, what's this DoD memo or this concept of equivalency that we hear about?
Yep, I'll try to do this quick. DoD basically realized that without a sponsor, there's a lot of systems that contractors want to use that they can't. So they have a way that if you don't have a sponsor, but you have a contract to another contractor who has a DoD contract, that there's a FedRAMP equivalency. It's very difficult, inefficient, but it does exist. If you're in that boat, Google that, and then you can always ask for more information.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, with that, we're at time. I know we had a bunch of questions come in. We tried to answer as many of those live as we could. I think we cleared all of them, but if there's any others that come in, we'll be sure to follow up and answer those. You'll have access to all of our contact information, so please reach out, set up discussions. We're happy to make the investment and do any type of workshops that would be helpful. And look out for chapters 2 and 3 that will be coming up, where we're going to do a deep dive into some of these more topics from a FedRAMP perspective and address any questions we get between now and then. So thank you all for the time. Hope you enjoyed today's session and look forward to seeing you on the next one.